Imagine it's 1929 and you are standing right in the middle of the New York Stock Exchange floor. The air around you is thick, signaling a financial slaughter. In just 6 hours, $14 billion, a massive figure back then, completely evaporated from America's pockets. 13 million shares were dumped onto the market in sheer panic. But the worst part wasn't that prices were dropping, it was that you were trading completely blind. The phone lines were jammed, and the ticker tape machines were running hours late because of the overload. You know you are losing money, but you don't even know how much you're losing. It's like being locked in a pitch-black room knowing there is a tiger stalking you, but not knowing which direction it will pounce from. Yet all of this started from the arrogance of just one man named Charles Mitchell, the guy who dared to publicly challenge the Federal Reserve. Mitchell engineered a slow, agonizing death that lasted 3 years. The market dropped 17%, then 33%, and finally 50%, dragging 5,000 banks into oblivion and pushing 25 million people out onto the streets. Today, you will understand exactly why one man could trigger a domino mechanism that crashed the world's largest economy, and why those signs from back then look like they are returning right now. If you watch until the end of this video, I guarantee you will look at the modern financial market with a completely new sense of caution. Welcome to the channel, The Capital Anatomy. Subscribe right now so you don't miss these vital analyses. Let's get started. 1. The truth about the slow death. You heard the figure $14 billion in the intro. That amount was larger than the entire value of the Canadian economy at the time. Picture the entire wealth, factories, and assets of a neighboring nation being wiped off the financial map in just one afternoon. And when I say the system was jammed, it was way more serious than your home Wi-Fi lagging. The legendary ticker tape machine of that era was running hours behind reality. Imagine you are driving a race car at 120 miles per hour, but the windshield is displaying the road from 2 hours ago. You hit the gas to buy because you think prices are going up, but in the present moment, your car has already plunged off a cliff. That is why people call this event a heavyweight champion getting knocked out by an amateur. No one believed such a magnificent system could collapse that fast, shattering social trust instantly. But here is where people get it wrong. You often hear about Black Thursday as the start of the Wall Street crash of 1929 and think everything ended there. It actually didn't. If the financial market were a patient, that day was just the first stroke. What killed the economy was the metastatic cancer that followed. If you held stocks through the end of 1929, you actually only lost 17%. Painful, but not fatal. But then in 1930, the market dropped another 33%. And by 1931, it evaporated another 50%. That was a slow death, a mental torture lasting 3 straight years. Its consequences weren't just on the electronic boards. It lasted a whole decade. 1 out of every 4 American men didn't have a job. 5,000 banks didn't just close temporarily, they disappeared forever, taking people's life savings to the grave. 2 million people had to live in shabby shantytowns, sarcastically called Hoovervilles, and the despair was so great that the suicide rate skyrocketed by 30%. And the victims weren't just greedy stock players in New York. Due to a disastrous tariff policy called Smoot-Hawley, exports fell by 60%. And as a result, farmers in the Midwest, people who had never seen a stock certificate in their lives, suddenly found no one wanted to buy their produce and got swept away in that vortex too. But to understand why this giant machine derailed, we can't blame the stars or fate. Everything started with the ambition and arrogance of a specific man. He was the director of National City Bank, hailed by the press as Sunshine Charlie. So sunny that he burned down the entire financial market. And here is where the story truly begins. Charlie Mitchell had a financial invention that permanently changed how Americans looked at debt. 2. The architect of illusion. You need to understand the era when Charlie Mitchell stepped onto the stage. It was the roaring 20s. Ford Model Ts were rolling down every road, jazz music rang out from underground speakeasies, and Americans lived with a new religious belief. Prosperity would last forever. But Charles Mitchell wasn't a financial aristocrat born on third base. He was born in 1877 into a farming family, growing up with the smell of soil, not money. It was this background that created a strange drive in him. The ambition to turn every ordinary American, from housewives to bricklayers, into a capitalist. By 1919, Mitchell took the helm of National City Bank, the largest bank in America at the time. Look at the assets he managed, $2.7 billion. To give you an idea, that number was bigger than the budget of most countries in the world back then. Mitchell wasn't just a bank director, he ran his own empire. But Mitchell saw a market problem. Before he showed up, stocks were an extremely exclusive club. Less than 1% of the US population, about 500,000 people, owned stocks. It was like caviar reserved only for the super rich. And this is where Mitchell made a genius but risky move. He decided to democratize speculation. He founded a subsidiary, National City Company, and did something unprecedented, selling stocks right at bank branches. Imagine walking into a bank to deposit savings, the place you trust most, and the teller who you view as a symbol of safety suddenly pitches you stocks, just like a supermarket clerk asks if you want a stick of gum at checkout. He blurred the line between a vault and a casino. But don't be naive thinking Mitchell did this just for profit. He had a much deeper political goal. He called it investors' democracy. Mitchell's logic was sharp. If every citizen owned stocks, their wallets would be tied to Wall Street. Then, the people would become a giant human shield. Any government wanting to control or punish banks would have to think twice, because hurting banks now meant hurting their own voters. Mitchell had built the stage, but to pull millions into this play, he needed a more powerful sales tool. And that is when he created the most aggressive sales force in financial history. 3. The sweet trap. Mitchell didn't sit around waiting for customers. He deployed a massive sales army across 69 branches nationwide, turning dry bankers into merchants of dreams. They didn't just sell stocks, they sold self-worth and grand visions. They would look you right in the eye and say, "Mr. Johnson, you don't plan on working for someone else your whole life, do you? For just $15 a month, your kids will be proud of you." Images of happy families, big houses, and cars were painted, making the fear of missing out, FOMO, suffocating, gradually leading people who didn't even know what a stock was to pour money into investing for some pipe dream. Not only that, the real weapon, the thing that turned the market from an investment channel into a national casino, was an invention called margin buying on margin. Let me explain this mechanism, because it is the drug of this entire story. Suppose you have $100. In a normal world, you can only buy $100 worth of stock. But Mitchell says, no, give me that $100 and I'll lend you another $900 so you can buy a full $1,000 of stock. Now, if the stock price goes up 20% to $1,200, you make $200. Look closely. The stock only went up 20%, but your principal capital increased by 200%. You just doubled your assets in the blink of an eye. Compared to the pennies in bank interest, this was like magic. And the consequences came instantly. By the summer of 1929, the addiction had spread across society. The number of stock players shot up from a modest 500,000 to 10 million. Margin lending volume went crazy, from $2 billion to $8.5 billion in just 4 years. Imagine this. Nearly 40 cents of every dollar lent in America back then wasn't flowing into factories or farms, but straight into the stock casino. And the house dealer of this casino? He lived like a king. In 1928, Mitchell pocketed $1.2 million in bonuses, equivalent to $20 million today, a staggering number. But here is the most ironic part. While encouraging housewives and bricklayers to drain their savings to build America, Mitchell was quietly selling his bank shares to his wife to create a fake loss to evade income tax. Truly financial advice for you, tax-free profits for me. The system was now like a tower of champagne glasses stacked up, beautiful, sparkling, but extremely fragile. Just a slight tremor, and it all shatters. And that tremor came, not from an external enemy, but from the panic of the borrowers themselves. Before we get to the moment of collapse, I want to ask you a question. Today, trading apps allow leverage very easily with just a tap. Do you think that is a tool to help people get rich, or a trap repeating the history of 1929? Comment opportunity or trap below. I really want to know your take. 4. The fateful decision. By early 1929, if you were sane, you could hear the sirens blaring. Stock prices were running faster than the legs of the real economy. Big companies were trading at 15 times annual earnings, a number that in financial language screams, the bubble is about to pop. The Federal Reserve also saw this. They tried to be the adult in the room by ordering banks to stop lending money for gambling. But unlike the Fed's calculations, the American bureaucratic system back then had a fatal flaw: internal disagreement. The NY Fed wanted to hike rates to 6% to kill the fever, but the big bosses at the Washington Fed shook their heads no. This hesitation was like seeing a house on fire, but the firefighters are standing there arguing about what color hose to use. In March, the market started shaking violently. The bubble almost burst. and it should have burst then to minimize damage. But just as the market was gasping for air, Charles Mitchell stepped onto the stage. On March 12, 1929, Mitchell held a press conference and did the unthinkable. He publicly slapped the Federal Reserve in the face. He coldly declared, "We feel we have an obligation which is paramount to any Federal Reserve warning to avert a crisis." And to prove he wasn't bluffing, he pledged to pump $25 million in cold hard cash into the market immediately. He said National City Bank would provide all necessary liquidity to keep the party going. This action was important not because of the $25 million, but because of the psychological signal it sent. Mitchell created an early version of the too big to fail concept. The subliminal message to millions of investors was clear. Keep playing, don't be scared. No matter what the government says, the big boys on Wall Street will always be here to back you up. The result? Instead of a healthy correction, the market plunged into the mad summer of 1929. The Dow Jones shot up to a peak of 381 points, a record that would take America 25 years to touch again. 3 million new people rushed into the frenzy, from wives secretly pawning jewelry to kids using their allowance to buy stocks. There is even a legend that when the shoeshine boy started giving stock tips to customers, you knew the end was near. Mitchell had bought the market some time, but he also ensured that when it crashed, the fall would be 1,000 times more painful. 5. The end of days. In the fall of 1929, the real economy and the stock market were like a couple that had separated, but was still trying to fake happiness in front of the neighbors. Industrial production dropped. Cars sat collecting dust in warehouses because no one was buying, but the boards on Wall Street were still glowing green. It was a classic Wile E. Coyote moment. The wolf had run off the cliff, feet pedaling in the air, but hadn't fallen yet because he hadn't looked down, but the sharks smelled blood. Joseph Kennedy, father of the future President JFK, sold all his stocks and pulled out for a simple reason. His shoeshine boy started giving him investment advice. Kennedy understood that when the last person in society had joined in, the party was over. The first domino didn't fall in New York, but in London. A massive fraud by Clarence Hattrey made the British market wobble. British investors, thirsty for cash to cover losses, started selling off assets in the US. Even worse, British Chancellor of the Exchequer Philip Snowden openly called the US market a speculative orgy, a sharp slap to international confidence. And this is where the margin mechanism I mentioned in part 3 came back to kill the market. Picture it like a noose. When prices dipped slightly due to selling pressure from the UK, brokers immediately called demanding margin payments. Deposit more money now, or I sell your stock. But investors didn't have any cash left. They were forced to sell. This forced selling pushed prices even lower, triggering the next wave of margin calls for others. It created a death spiral. Prices drop, forced to sell. Prices drop deeper, forced to sell again. Modern economists call this state min-ma-SS, the minimum Minsky moment of stability, where the leverage system is so high that just a light nudge, like the Hattrey case, is enough to collapse the whole structure. In the panic of Black Thursday, Oct. 24, banking tycoons, including Mitchell's faction, tried to reenact the savior play. They pooled $750 million to buy blue-chip stocks like U.S. Steel to create false confidence, and it worked. For exactly 2 days. By Black Tuesday, Oct. 29, it shattered. America lost another $14 billion in just 1 day. To give you an idea of this madness, the money evaporated that day was more than the total cost America spent fighting World War I. And as I warned, this was just the opening shot for the slow death. The market dropped 17% that year, then 33% the next, and 50% the year after. Question for you right now. When a market collapses due to greed, do you think the government should jump in to save it to stabilize society, or let it burn to cleanse the system? Comment your view, save or burn down below. 6. Human tragedy and the price paid. People often say, 1 death is a tragedy, 1,000,000 deaths is a statistic. But to truly understand the brutality of 1929, you need to forget the dry numbers and look at Edward Hopkins. He was a skilled mechanic who saved up $5,000 over his whole life. He put it all into Ford stock, hoping to retire early. The result? After the crash, he not only lost everything, but also owed the broker $3,000 in margin. Hopkins chose to end his life with a rope right in the garage where he used to fix cars every day. Or take Mary Cayfield, an elementary school teacher. She mortgaged her parents' house to buy Radio Corporation stock because she believed the ads. The crash caused the bank to foreclose on the home, pushing 3 generations of her family onto the streets in the freezing winter. At that time, the Brooklyn Bridge was no longer a symbol of engineering. It became the bridge of despair because of the number of people choosing it as the place to throw themselves into the icy river. Multiply that pain by 25 million times the number of unemployed people. Add to that the disappearance of 5,000 banks and 2 million homeless people living vaguely in tent cities. In the countryside, farmers took another fatal punch from the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, causing exports to drop 60%. All of America sank into darkness. So where was the architect of this disaster? Sunshine Charlie Mitchell, the man lighting up the financial world. In 1933, he was dragged before Congress. When Senator Carter Glass questioned his moral responsibility, Mitchell calmly replied, "I only wanted to give people a chance to get rich." The angry mob called him the architect of financial disaster. In the end, Mitchell was indicted for evading $850,000 in taxes, forced to resign in disgrace, and died fading into oblivion in 1955. But here is the most ironic part. A punch in the face of justice that you need to remember well. Charles Mitchell died, but his legacy is immortal. National City Bank didn't collapse. On the contrary, it was deemed by the government as too big to fail, bailed out with cash, and even got stronger by acquiring the cheap assets of smaller dead banks. Today, that bank still exists. You know it by the name Citibank. And Mitchell wasn't the only rotten apple. Even Richard Whitney, president of the New York Stock Exchange, the man considered the policeman of the market, later had to sit in jail for embezzling public funds. This proves that the 1929 disaster wasn't just due to a financial bubble, but its main fuel was systemic moral corruption. The question is, are we repeating that mistake? Or have we learned the lesson? The answer will surprise you in the final part. 7. Historical lessons and current connections. After the storm, the government was forced to put up barriers to stop history from repeating itself. In 1933, the Glass-Steagall Act was born, basically building a reinforced concrete wall between Grandma's Savings Bank and Wall Street's risky investment casino. The SEC was created to act as a referee, and deposit insurance appeared to ensure you wouldn't lose everything if a bank collapsed. President Roosevelt even had to perform a painful major surgery, ordering the confiscation of gold from the public to print money to save the economy. But look at the phone in your hand right now. Mark Twain once said, "History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes." Today, over 50 million Americans are trading stocks via apps like Robinhood, with sweet promises of commission-free trading and a mission to democratize finance. Sound familiar? That is the exact logic of Charles Mitchell, but wrapped in a digital 4 casing. The scarier number is that margin debt today has hit a record $900 billion. The average American currently owes more than they earn in a whole year. This atmosphere of euphoria and borrowing smells exactly like 1929. So, how do you avoid becoming the next victim of this cycle? There are 3 survival principles you need to etch into your bones. First, if getting rich is that easy, ask yourself, who is selling this dream and what do they gain from me? Remember, in a gold rush, the richest person is always the one selling shovels, or in this case, the casino owner collecting margin fees. Second, financial leverage isn't a tool to help you get rich quick. It is a catalyst that makes your account evaporate instantly when the market sneezes. And finally, most importantly, never confuse price with value. When you see stock prices skyrocketing while the real economy is gloomy, don't think it's an opportunity. It's a trap. When you believe someone will definitely save the market, that is usually when systemic risk has hit its peak. Next time you hear about once-in-a-lifetime opportunities or promises that this time is different, remember the name Sunshine Charlie, the man who used $25 million to challenge the Federal Reserve, pumping the balloon to the max, only to watch it explode and sweep away the wealth of a whole generation. Don't let the greed and arrogance of the house dealers turn you into a sad footnote in financial history. Thanks for watching the video from the Capital Anatomy. If you find this knowledge valuable, hit like and subscribe right now to join us in decoding the secrets of cash flow in upcoming videos. See you again.